It's very civilized to be able to talk sitting down. I hope it's not a tribute to my advanced age. In the last week or two, a number of polls have been issued from the leading polling agencies in the world, which have some quite interesting results that bear rather directly on the title for this evening's presentations, the consequences of the new imperial grand strategy, as the Bush program was described by the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, shortly after it was officially announced in September 2002, the national security strategy. The most obvious effects, of course, are the international ones, which only were released a few days ago. Turns out that in the Muslim world, almost everywhere, substantial majorities regard the United States as a military threat to them. That's over 70% in Indonesia, Turkey, Nigeria, Pakistan, other countries. In Europe, majorities regard the United States as a threat to world peace. That's Holland, England, France, elsewhere. They report that the distrust and dislike of the United States has doubled or tripled in many countries over the past year. Well, that has consequences. People who feel threatened tend to react, and sometimes they react violently. We have already seen such reactions as predicted. It was predicted in advance of the invasion of Iraq that by independent analysts, by intelligence agencies. A few weeks ago we learned by the National Intelligence Estimate of the United States, just before the war, it was predicted that it would increase the threat of terror. And in fact, that's happened. Another aspect of the new imperial grand strategy, which has been less discussed, but is far more serious in its implications and has also had extreme reactions, is the what's called the transformation of the American military, the rapid expansion of offensive, highly destructive military capacity. So a few weeks after the national security strategy was announced, the Air Force Space Command announced its plans for the next 4 years, and they intend to move from what they call control of space for military purposes, Clinton's policy in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. They're going to move from control of space to ownership of space, which is consistent with the national security strategy. No challenge tolerated anywhere. And they go on to explain that means instant engagement anywhere in the world, highly lethal, destructive weapons from space, attacking unannounced, anywhere in the world under close surveillance. If you continue to read these programs, they describe in detail how this capacity can be developed and what it'll mean. Well, maybe it isn't discussed here, but foreign intelligence agencies read it. They can find it on the same websites where I did or where you can. It's not a secret. And they react as expected, as predicted. So in the past, during the Bush years, according to U.S. estimates, Russia has maybe tripled its military spending. It's displaying new offensive military weapons, nuclear-tipped missiles, more advanced, aimed at the United States. They've adopted the Bush strategy of first strike effectively without pretext. These are on hair-trigger alert, many of them. This means being controlled by automated systems. We know that our systems have many, many errors, which require human intervention to prevent a missile launch. Theirs are far less sophisticated, deteriorating as the Soviet economy deteriorates. We're essentially asking them to set the basis for an accidental war which will happen to destroy us all. Furthermore, we're compelling the Russians to transfer missiles all over their territory, huge territory, to counter U.S. threats being opposed at all their borders. These are taken in trains that any intelligent Chechen terrorist can intercept, meaning advanced nuclear missiles going into the worst imaginable hands. China, until recently, has kept from participating in this. They're the one nuclear state that doesn't have much of an offensive military capacity, but that's changing. They've just announced that they're tripling their offensive nuclear missile capacity and moving towards a high-tech military with offensive weapons, very similar to what I just described, within the next few years. This is not unnoticed by U.S. strategic analysts who predicted it, and it's happening. Just a couple of weeks ago, two of the leading U.S. strategic analysts, very responsible, respectable, not given to hyperbole, wrote that these policies, these transformation of the military policies, and of course the expected reactions to them, may lead to what they call ultimate doom. And they go on to express their hope that China will lead a coalition of peace-loving countries to counter U.S. aggressiveness and militarism. We've come to a pretty pass when we read that in mainstream journals. Other recently released studies shed a good deal of light on the state of American democracy. So might be worth bearing in mind if you have a strong enough stomach to watch what's happening later. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations publishes regular, careful, detailed reports of popular attitudes on international affairs. And they always make interesting reading. And the latest one, which just came out, does particularly so. So here's a few examples. Majorities of Americans, often large majorities, believe that the United States should support the Kyoto protocols, the nuclear test ban, and other disarmament treaties. A majority believe that the United States should join the International Criminal Court, even if Americans are threatened with prosecution. They believe that the United Nations, not the United States, should take the lead in international crises, and that the U.S. should accede to majority wishes, even if it opposes the decisions. In fact, rather amazingly, a majority even are in favor of eliminating the veto in the Security Council. The U.S. overwhelmingly is in the lead in vetoing resolutions in the last 40 years. This has applications in Iraq. Other polls have shown that a majority of the population in the United States has about the same stand as the Spanish voters who last March voted for what was called here withdrawing troops from Iraq, but it wasn't withdrawing troops unless they were under UN supervision. For a long time, about 60 or 70% of the American population have felt that the UN, not the U.S., should take the lead in Iraq in security matters, economic reconstruction, political changes, and so on. Large majority believe that the United States should join the World Court, the International Court of Justice. The Reagan administration, pretty much the people in office now, withdrew World Court jurisdiction when it was about to condemn the United States, as it did, for what amounts to international terrorism in its attack against Nicaragua. A majority believe that a large plurality in this case, believe that the U.S. should rely on diplomatic and economic rather than military means in combating terror. And quite strikingly, a large majority oppose preventive war. That's the U.S. official doctrine held by both candidates in gross violation of international law and the Nuremberg Charter. A large majority think that the United States should keep within the UN Charter limits. That about 25% say the U.S. should, any state, should resort to force only if attacked. It's a narrow interpretation of the Charter. And over half say accept a slightly broader interpretation of the Charter, accepting the legitimacy of preemptive war, which means use of force when you are an attack is imminent. So like a plane's flying across the Atlantic to bomb New York or something like that. So around 75% totally oppose official policy of both parties on a very crucial issue. Large majorities believe that the United States should increase spending on health, education, and social security. On specific issues, there are also stands are taken radically different from the elite bipartisan consensus. So on Israel-Palestine, 75% believe the United States should be neutral. 17% think it should tilt toward Israel. Well, all of these things are interesting in themselves. They also tell us a lot about the state of American democracy, because these positions are off the agenda. They're not in the electoral agenda. The positions are barely advocated in anywhere near the mainstream, which means that most of the people who gave those responses have never heard them. They're making them up for themselves. Probably think they're the only people who hold them. If these issues were a topic of live debate and discussion, I don't think there's much doubt that the numbers would be much higher. Well, that is one illustration of a serious democratic deficit, the technical term for countries that have formal democratic institutions, but they don't function substantively. The polls on the election reveal the same thing. Two weeks ago, the Gallup polls asked people, voters, why they're voting for Bush or Kerry, and they had a set of choices. One of the choices was favor their agenda, ideas, and platform goals. For Bush, that's 6% of Bush's voters. For Kerry, it's 13% of Bush's voters. In other words, practically nobody's is voting for them because of their stand on anything. And that's the way elections are structured. Elections are effectively run by the PR industry, which constructs extravaganzas and which come up every couple of years and tries to focus laser-like attention on them so that that's what people will think of as politics, personalized extravaganzas intermittently, where you focus on qualities, as they call them. Is he a strong leader? Would you like to meet him? Or something like that. Not on their stands, not on issues. They have to be kept off the agenda. And if you look at people's attitudes on issues, you can see why. It's not an irrational choice. Well, much of the world perceives this, even if we prefer not to, and it adds to the threat. A couple of words about Iraq. I don't have to talk about the fact that the pretexts for the invasion have successively eroded, so their history. But as they collapse, new ones come along. About a year ago, the discussion fixed on the new standard position, that is, the U.S. invaded Iraq to fulfill what the liberal press calls Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq and the Middle East and the world and so on. The reaction in the United States was intriguing. There was near unanimous agreement that that was the goal. Try to find an exception. There are critics, plenty of critics. The critics say it's overreaching, it's not going to work. Noble, inspiring, but beyond our means. Iraqi culture is not advanced enough to be able to accept such dramatic steps or something like that. We have to be more realistic. Actually, there's one sector of opinion that disagrees, Iraqis. Just at the time that Bush's messianic vision was announced with great fanfare in Washington, the Washington Post happened to publish a poll of people in Baghdad who were asked why they think the United States invaded Iraq. And there were some who agreed with near unanimous opinion here, 1%. 1% said the goal was to establish democracy. Most of the rest said the obvious. The U.S. invaded Iraq to take control of Iraq's extraordinary energy resources and to have a position to reorganize the region in its interest. Actually, the result was a little more nuanced. 50% said the U.S. wants democracy, but will not allow Iraqis to make their own choices within it. The U.S. will insist on influencing it. That's a sophisticated judgment on what imposition of democracy actually means in the history of the West, England and the Middle East, the United States and its domains, and so on. Well, what is the evidence for and against the view that the U.S. invaded to fulfill Bush's messianic vision? The evidence for it is very straightforward. The president said so. Try to find some other evidence to support that conclusion. Well, statements of benign intent by leaders are totally meaningless. They're completely predictable. They carry no information. And no matter how grotesque the monster is, they make such statements, so we discard them. But apparently not here. It seems that there's near 100% agreement, even among critics. What's the evidence against? I'm not going to run through it, because that would take another hour talk, but it's just about anything you look at. I mean, their own history under the British, which also had pretensions of independence and sovereignty, the history of U.S. domains, long-standing U.S. policy going back to the mid-1940s, which were to control the oil of the Middle East because of what one historian of the industry calls profits beyond the dreams of avarice, but more importantly because it was what was called a stupendous source of strategic power. As Zbigniew Brzezinski put it a few months ago, control of the resources of the Middle East gives the United States critical leverage over the economies of Europe and Asia. Those have been the main competitors and rivals, and a long-standing concern of U.S. policy is they might go in their own independent way, and it still is. You control the lever, you get critical leverage, what George Kennan once called veto power. Actually, 5 minutes thought about what the policies of a sovereign, independent Iraq would be suffices to show that it would never be tolerated. I won't go into that, but think about it. Well, all of this is off the agenda, and it's another illustration of a very serious democratic deficit, something that should concern us. Well, if this conception is accurate, in other words, the Iraqis aspire to the same vision that's described here, and Iraqis agree that there is a cultural problem, social and cultural problem, blocking it, but they think that problem's here, not there. And I think they have a reasonable argument. If that turns out, if that is in fact true, then that's actually a hopeful sign. Because if this problem is here, we can do something about it. A lot. In fact, anything. We're very free, we're very privileged, plenty of opportunities. We don't have to pray that China will rescue the world from U.S. militarism and aggressiveness. We can take care of that right here. But that requires understanding what the problems are, perceiving the democratic deficit, and not being trapped into a belief that democracy means pushing a lever for somebody you like, whose stand you don't understand every couple of years. It's not democracy. It's everyday work to create the basis for a functioning democracy. We have plenty of opportunities. It is possible for them to compel the government, either one, no matter who wins, because they have the same policies in this regard, to compel them to abandon the major war aims in Iraq, which Iraqis understand, even if we prefer not to, and that means going on to dismantle global policies, which are very deeply rooted in U.S. history and institutions. It's a lot of work, but within reach. And if that conception is anywhere near accurate, I think it is, there are fateful choices for us to make, fateful for Iraq, for ourselves, and indeed far beyond.
If a few people very quickly want to come up to the microphone to ask a question, and you'll have to make those brief. I just wanted to observe that both the president and vice president have said that they would do again what they did, and that was invade Iraq, that they think they did the right thing. And that's the Republican ticket for 2004. What might have surprised many is that John Kerry said something similar. When he was asked at his campaign stop at the Grand Canyon if he knew then what he knew now, would he vote the same way, which was he voted for the invasion, he said yes. I think that shocked a lot of people. But his tune did seem to change right around the time of the convention. Maybe that's because on Sunday, the day before the Republican National Convention, the largest mass protest in the history of U.S. political conventions took place outside Madison Square Garden. 500,000 people marched. And as people line up, I was wondering if either of all of you would like to respond very quickly to a most obvious question, which is, do you see a distinction when it comes to the issue of American empire and this invasion and occupation between the two major party candidates, John Kerry and George Bush, in what they would do? Noam Chomsky.
In the case of Iraq, I think their positions are very difficult to distinguish. They might have initiated different policies, but given what's there now, there doesn't seem to be much difference. Both seem committed to the war aim that I think Iraqis properly understand, gaining control of Iraqi oil, which is indeed unique in the world. It's the last known huge, basically untapped, even unexplored source of very cheap and easily accessible oil. So we control that and establish a base in they hope, a dependent client state with military bases for gaining control over the region, both for the reasons that Mike eloquently described, and also for the reasons that Zbigniew Brzezinski, my greatest hero, described, I think, accurately. It does grant the U.S. Critical leverage over others. And that's been a long-standing problem. There are rivals. They might go in an independent course. On empire generally, I think there are some differences. I assume that Kerry would follow roughly the Clinton policies. These are not elections between individuals, but between groups of advisors and constituencies, and his is roughly Clinton's. So in the case of, for example, militarization of space and other aspects of the massive expansion of offensive and destructive military capacity, the Clinton position was more nuanced, similar position, but there is a difference between control of space and ownership of space for military purposes and everything that flows from it. There are major differences, I think, domestically, but it's a separate issue.
The Bush administration would like Americans to think there's no particular difference between John Kerry and George W. Bush on the war in Iraq. John Kerry stands in the middle ground on this war. He doesn't stand where I stand. I'm not running for president. I wouldn't get elected dog catcher in this country. I'm grateful that John Kerry is addressing most of his political thrust to people who are undecided on this election. But I also think it's crucial to listen to the whole man his whole life story, and the mantra of what he says, which I believe is a credible position and one that needs to be really affirmed in this political season going forward. He would only go to war when it's necessary. And the bottom line is that the deception about this war was its necessity. There was no necessity for this war. And that's a theme to which Kerry has been, on which he's been consistent and to which he returns again and again. There is a world of difference between John Kerry and George W. Bush on the question of the war in Iraq. And on that difference, this election stands.
In the interest of discussion, I'll pass, because I share Jim's feeling.
Yeah.
Professor Chomsky, a few months ago, when you were asked in Milton, Massachusetts, about how we get progressive radio programs on, such as Democracy Now!, into the Boston area, you talked about the tight grip that the Boston radio stations have over their content. Today, the executive director of WBUR stepped down amidst a lot of controversy about patronage, etc. In this window of opportunity, is there anything we can do to help get Amy on locally in larger stations than Boston colleges?
I think there's quite a lot that we can do. Walking in here today, somebody told me that they can watch Democracy Now! On Cambridge cable television. That could be done in every town in the region, everywhere, in fact. There's plenty of options there. They're not exploited as fully as they should be. And the same, I don't know about WBUR, but the same can be done on many radio stations.
Let me say, I don't know that person, but very good point. Democracy Now! Is broadcasting in Boston on Cambridge Community Television in Cambridge, Boston Neighborhood Network, on WZBC Boston College every day, and it also broadcasts on both satellite networks. Dish Network every day, channel 9415, which is free speech TV, and on DirecTV, channel 375, which is Link TV. We also video and audio stream at democracynow.org, where millions of people access the program around the globe, and are broadcasting on more than 275 radio and television stations, NPR stations, where we beat All Things Considered and Morning Edition hands down in fundraising, so maybe BUR or BGH would be interested, GBH would be interested. On public access TV, anyone can get us on their public access TV station, increasingly on PBS stations. So you can just call your stations. These are public radio and television. You are the public.
In order for dissent to be effective, it's helpful if the dissenter gets heard, and also it's helpful if he or she doesn't get crushed after he or she speaks out. That's why it's so important to have esteemed professors like yourself at places like MIT or Columbia, representing the left, who have the ability to get heard and also can't so easily be crushed. But who are your successors?
Who
are your successors?
Are you asking me? I mean, you know, there are vibrant, lively, popular movements all over the country. There are many more of them there have ever been in the past, at least in my lifetime. They're disorganized. We're a disorganized, disunited, atomized country, but they're all over the place. And out of them come speakers. Speakers don't come from nowhere. You know? They come from popular movements that exist. I mean, for example, I was talking on the Vietnam War in churches 40 years ago, but there were maybe 4 people in the audience. You know, the minister, the organizer, somebody who wandered in because he was, you know, hungry or something, and another person who would have been happy to kill me. And this went on until popular movements developed. They've expanded, developed, undertaken all sorts of actions on every imaginable issue, sometimes quite effectively. It's changed the country, and it's created the opportunity in which, when I go home tonight, it's like every other night, spend half an hour turning down invitations, not because I don't want to take them, but because I can't. And there's plenty of opportunity for others to do the same, and many are. Just compare the war in Iraq with the war in Vietnam. The war in Iraq happens to be the first time in the history of the West, Europe and the United States, in which there was massive public protest against a war before it was officially launched. In the case of the war in Vietnam, which was far more destructive and violent and brutal and a far more criminal act, it took years before there was any protest at all, literally. And by the time protest was visible, South Vietnam had been practically wiped out. And even then, the protest was mostly against a peripheral part, the bombing of the North. That's a huge change in consciousness over 40 years. And that's where activists, organizers come from, where the opportunities for speakers to contribute what they can comes from. So the groundwork is there. All that's needed is to use the opportunities. You can be a speaker, for example.
Hello, just a quick comment and then a question for Professor Chomsky. I just want to thank all the panelists wholeheartedly for your healing and enlightening words this evening. Thank you very much. And for Amy Goodman, I watch your show every day, Monday through Friday, and thank you for helping to somewhat end my ignorance, and especially the coverage on Haiti was really incredible, and on Reagan as well. And my question, Dr. Chomsky, is I heard that there was a letter, although I didn't see it, but there was a letter written to Ralph Nader asking him to drop out of the presidential race, and this letter had numerous signatures on it from prominent individuals, yourself being one, so I heard. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Am I incorrect about that?
Yeah, completely incorrect.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Well, so then let me just ask this question, which is, Ralph Nader was interviewed on Democracy Now! The other day, and I think it was kind of a poignant interview where he stated that he felt that many prominent individuals on the left that had supported him before now did not support him, and he felt that a lot on the left had lost their nerve. So I just open the question to all the panelists then. Do you agree with that, and how do you feel about that?
Well, I can't speak for others, but my position on this election is exactly the same as it was in 2000. Namely that the election itself, given the huge democratic deficit in the United States, and the fact that elections have become a marginal issue, in my opinion, where issues are shunted to the side insofar as they exist, and the massive focus is on personality, personalized extravaganzas. Given that fact, the most important reaction to an election is to not pay too much attention to it and go on with the important work of, building popular organizations, increasing activism, reconstructing a democratic culture in which elections will be as meaningful as, say, they are in the second largest country in this hemisphere, Brazil. However, elections exist. We can't ignore them. Spend a little time thinking about what you should do. In my opinion, it should take about 5 minutes to figure out what to do in this one. And my opinion was the same in the year 2000 as it is now. In a swing state where the vote may matter, I think you should vote to keep out the more dangerous, and they are dangerous, of the two, not candidates, but groups. Personalization is something we should ignore. These are just two different groups, two different constituencies, and so on. They're different, and the one around Bush, I think, is very dangerous. So where your vote matters, I feel, as I did in the year 2000, one should vote to keep them out. In a safe state where your vote doesn't affect things, you got a lot of choices. I mean, if your interest is in, say, party building for the long term, you would cast the vote for those who are day after day, year after year, working on party building. If your interest is something else, vote for that. If you think a way to protest to express your opposition to the personalized quadrennial extravaganzas is to abstain, do that. I think that was a sane position in the year 2000. I think it is now. I don't think we should spend a lot of time thinking about it or talking about it, because there are much more important things to do.
I feel a rare note of disagreement with Noam Chomsky, and I just want to register it. I think there's a huge difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in this country now. The Republican Party is becoming a dangerous party in the United States at every level, and it should be opposed at every level, and every opportunity there is to vote against it should be taken.
Even when it doesn't matter.
It always matters.
Like
it always matters. In Massachusetts, everywhere, it always matters. On the whole range of issues, personal freedom, questions of sexual ethics.
Even if the choice is already determined.
Absolutely.
That's what a safe state is. A safe state is one where, by definition,
this is a safe state only in relationship to the presidential election.
Right, and on other issues, that's a good
It's
point.
a matter of party building,
Absolutely.
It's a matter of public affirmation, and it's a matter of really understanding that there is a major conflict in this country right now that must be engaged at every level. And the Democratic Party, which is far from perfect, simply must be supported wherever it's possible
even
to
if the
support it.
Republican candidate happens to be a more progressive one. I mean, in the past, I've voted for Republicans.
Well, if you give me an example on that one, we could discuss it.
For example, during the 1960s, the most outspoken opponents of the Vietnam War at the congressional level happened to be Massachusetts Republicans, and I voted for them. It's certainly true that at the local, regional, sometimes state level, you should do whatever is important to do. The issue that was raised, the safe state, swing state issue, solely has to do with presidential election. Solely with that.
Michael Klare.
Because this is such an important topic. And also bear in mind that some people are voting for the first time ever, and there's been a huge increase in registration by young people and marginalized voters for whom this is an existential act, and an important existential act. Even though I understand Noam's analysis, I think it's such an important act, and I agree with James Carroll that these people are dangerous. And just think where we are now compared to where we were 4 years ago. Imagine where we'll be 4 years from now if the Republicans are still in power. I shudder to think where our freedoms will be then. And so even voting in a swing state against the Republicans, I think, is crucial. A safe state, I'm sorry. Even in a safe state, as an existential act of expression of opposition for those for whom it is their first vote, and for others, I think it's crucial.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, we'll only be able to take one more question.
Amy Goodman, first I just wanted to thank you for a talk that you gave at Evergreen State College in 2003. It's what brought me here and to listening to these people and to you every day. But Professor Chomsky, the other day on the vice presidential debate, Dick Cheney related his experience as an election monitor in El Salvador in 1983. And I was just curious, at the time it screamed out to me that I wanted to have your context of what was happening in 1983 when Dick Cheney was an election monitor there. It seemed to bring almost a tear to his eye.
In 1983, the U.S. was engaged in major wars throughout Central America. In some cases, the U.S. controlled the government and therefore was able to rely on state security forces to crush and destroy efforts at independence and democracy. In fact, was fighting a major war against the church in El Salvador at the time. There was what's sometimes called a demonstration election, an election held under conditions of extreme terror and violence. Cheney, I didn't know he observed it, but he could have. It was a pretty meaningless election. There was actually a much more important election in 1984 in Nicaragua, which was a country that was under military attack, but where the state security forces were not the terrorist force. It was being supported by actually bipartisan support in the United States in various ways to try to crush the independent government. Nevertheless, they had an election which was monitored very heavily. It was the most heavily monitored election, I think, in the history of maybe anywhere, certainly Latin America. Latin American Studies Association, a very hostile Dutch government official delegation, the British Parliamentary Human Rights delegation, and so on. And they judged it a pretty fair election by Latin American standards. Here it was wiped out of discussion across the spectrum because it came out the wrong way. So almost universally what is said here is the first election was 1990 because that one came out the right way. Under a gun, I should say. The 1984 election was free by regional standards, certainly. Came out the wrong way, didn't take place. That's the kind of thing we should be concerned about. And that's bipartisan, unfortunately.
For fear of being accused of flip-flopping, we will allow in one last question. And then the authors, our speakers, will be going into the bookshop and or staying here, and books are going to be sold in the bookshop. And I really do want to encourage people to buy these books. I want to just stress, in talking about the politics of publishing, what an enormous difference it makes when books like these make it, when people in this country start to read these different points of view. There is a proliferation of conservative imprints at publishers, and when they learn that there is, well, they call it markets, but communities of people, which I would say represent the majority of people in this country, that are interested in books like Blood and Oil, like Crusade, Chronicles of an Unjust War, and Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, that when those books succeed, for every one of those books, it makes room for another book. And it is an extremely important message to be sent. And it also sends a message to the corporate media in this country that there are other experts out there, outside of that small circle of pundits who know so little about so much. Last question.
I want to start, first of all, thank you for the panel. But I want to, since we talk about the, I don't know how.
Just get right into it.
Oh, okay. We talk about the empire making. I want to know how Sudan and question of Darfur fits in, because we are right now. Colin Powell said that there is genocide in Darfur, yet we just ignore genocide in Palestine. Second, we're talking about empire. First of all, I disagree with Mr. Carroll that there is a lot of difference between John Kerry and Bush. As we know what they are doing, a lot of people, including in the elite, disagree about the invasion of Iraq, and they think actually it's not in the interest of empire. That's interesting. I can mention many names. The reason is because they believe really this does not serve the interest of empire, rather it serves the interest of Israel. And one thing that you talk so much about the foreign policy, what I'm saying that is not interest of the empire, I'm talking about from foreign policy point of view, not about other issues, education or other things. And you just totally ignored, just somehow push aside the question of Israel. Many people talking about Israelization of the foreign policy and the question of neocon, because even Jennifer Matthew last night mentioned from Carnegie Hall endowment that Bush did not go into war with free will. she was mentioning the role of neocon about that. Otherwise, why, for example, not only in the Middle East, we are looking for oil, but also in Africa, they have the oil of Chad for 11%. Tomorrow, probably Chadian people are going to pick up, the gun and fight. And then the question is, I want to know what is the role of Israel in the, the empire and Middle East. Right now, they're pushing for invasion in other countries because they are looking to eliminate their enemy through the power of United States. Thank you.
The question of Israel.
Well, I'm glad to have the chance to address this, the implication of your question, because I didn't hear a full, clear statement, but I would like to just suggest that we should be very careful of blaming the problem of the war in Iraq on Israel. This is not Israel's problem. This is America's problem. And there is a movement, there is an impulse, there is a kind of instinctive reaction that looks to blame Israel. And it's wrong. Having said that, the struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians is crucial and is clearly involved in this centrally. And my own position is that the United States of America has failed that struggle. The Bush administration, by not pressing the Sharon government to be, less reliant on overwhelming force, less reliant on the dead or alive impulse that comes from Washington. Also, the United States of America has to absolutely recommit to the peace process, the possibility of the realization of the ambitions of both peoples. And it is simply not inconsistent with full and complete support for the call for justice for the Palestinian people to also affirm the clear and absolute right for the security of the people of Israel.